Milo Yiannopoulos is on with us. His new book, Dangerous, been on the New York Times bestseller list for going on 4 weeks now. And this incredible book scans. I was privy to seeing some of the book scans, and the book is outselling the #1 bestseller in most weeks. But the New York Times is fake news, as they say. So, Milo, it is apropos that you're on, because you were really the person who wrote with your colleague Alan Bakari, still at Breitbart, the most intelligent and fair description of the alt-right, with all of its warts, but also with where they are ahead of the curve on certain things. And the alt-right, of course, is being blamed single-handedly for the fiasco, the melee that took place over the weekend, despite the fact that it looks like the Democratic government failed, the police department failed, and Antifa, these really fascist rioters, in kind of escalated everything. But yet again, we are in a situation where the alt-right is being victimized. You're the guy who understands the alt-right the best. So what's the truth?
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me. Nice to speak to you again. I remember that piece very well, because it was a piece that angered, I think, both the left and the right. And it was our attempt to give an accurate guide to the contours of this new thing called the alt-right. Now, at the time, we were using that expression descriptively. We were using it to describe a particular exciting, what we thought was an exciting new populist, nationalist, anti-political correctness movement. But subsequent to that, the term came to mean something else. And now it's no longer used descriptively. It's instead used sort of synonymously with neo-Nazi by the left to mean that somebody is undesirable and that you should shun them. So it's sort of used in place of a curse word, really. And any attempt to define it meaningfully is now going to fail, because the left has taken, this particular bit of descriptive language and used it, as they do with so many other things. So they've reduced it to meaning racist. So it's not a term that I use or that anybody should associate with these days. But there was a time in which the alt-right was as broadly defined, like we defined it in our piece, was an interesting movement. And that movement remains absolutely vital and full of life. And it's the movement that elected Donald Trump. We just can't call it alt-right anymore. As for what's going on in these marches,
And here's what's interesting, Milo. Let me jump in here, because I was discussing with Ezra Doulis, who's my right-hand man, deputy managing editor for Breitbart News, who runs our Twitter account, and he's a young guy. He pays attention to this stuff, and we were discussing him doing a update to your story and kind of saying it's been a year since you put out your alt-right story where you did break down what it is, and just to kind of talk about the evolution of the term, talk about the evolution of the movement. And of course, we disavow. I don't even have to ask you if you disavow any racism, because we know you only sleep with black men. So people know I'm actually not joking with that. So, but the issue is the distortions from the media, and the issue is the way that it has been used, which you identified early on, that there is a racial element to it that is horrifying and deplorable and despicable and all of that. But it is being used to kind of villainize a group of people that might not necessarily fit the exact media description.
Well, there aren't many white supremacists in America, maybe a couple of hundred of them, but there are plenty of Western supremacists in America. And it's those people, it's the millions who voted for Donald Trump, who think that the West is the best, who don't like political correctness, who do like capitalism and democracy and property rights and freedom, and, sticking your nose up at institutions and authorities, figures, and who don't like the government very much. Those people who, Generation Trump, or, the Republican base, however you want to describe them, those people are the existential threat to the left. The people who are not white supremacists, but Western supremacists. They're the people the left hates the most, because the left is constantly advocating, of course, for, whether it is socialized healthcare and ultimately kind of communist political doctrines, or whether it is cultural Marxism in universities, in the media, or in Hollywood. People who love and embrace the values of Western civilization are the left's greatest enemy, and they have to be destroyed at all costs. One of the ways the left does that is pretending that people who like Western values are really talking about skin color. So it's a sort of sleight of hand. It's a nasty bit of trickery they do. If you talk about how great the West is, if you talk about how brilliant democracy and freedom and America is, they will suggest that that's really code for you only liking white people. Of course, it's ridiculous, but that's how the way the left operates. And then they will pile a further indignity on you, of course, which is that they will say, when, as inevitably happens, their own violent instincts prompt altercations between loons from the far left and loons from the far right, neither of whom have many supporters in the wider America. Richard Spencer and all these kind of types from the wacky fringe white supremacist right, they really don't have many supporters in America at all. But when they finally are moved to pick up their citronella tiki candles and get into scuffles in the street, because Antifa and because the left, which the institutional left will never disavow and refuse to say a bad word about, while requiring us, of course, to say white supremacy is terrible all day, every day on the radio, or we're Nazis. When these two far right and far left, these fringe groups eventually get into an altercation, the right is then blamed for this. So it's suggested that the right is the violent factor, despite the fact that the left invented political violence, despite the fact that the left is clearly the source of 95% of it, and that the left has created an environment, where there is a racial element here. And I think it's important to be honest about this, is that there is a racial element here, but it is the product of the left. There are some statistics that are suggesting that KKK membership is ratcheting upwards. Well, why might that be? Could it have anything to do with the fact that the left has been on a crusade against straight white men, making people think about themselves in tribal terms they never would have before? And this is the central problem with progressive politics. It's a central problem about the way the left views the world. If you're going to split everybody up into groups with identity politics, make everybody consider, what am I? I'm a straight white male. I'm a gay, black, lesbian. If you're going to do that, you have to have identity politics for everyone. You can't have it just for some groups and not for others. So if you're telling 13, 14, 15-year-old kids what matters about you isn't the content of your character, your aspirations, your hard work, what matters about you isn't who you have turned yourself into, what you have become, who you want to be, but what you were born with, your skin color, who you want to have sex with, and whether you're a boy or a girl. If you talk about that's what matters about them, they're going to start to associate with people tribally in a way that we saw in Charlottesville. And you don't want that, because the left has successfully identified the straight white male as the architect of Western civilization, and it hates the straight white male as a result. But as the architect of Western civilization, if you start a war with that group, you're going to lose. So the left is both strategically dumb and also just hateful and divisive and horrible, all the while hurling insults at the right and claiming that the right is the cause of all of these problems. And that's why I hate them so much. And that's why you're right to hate them if you're listening to this and you've never quite been able to put your foot on what's really going on and what they're doing. They are awful, odious, terrible people who blame others for their own sins and who are the root cause of the vast majority of discontent in this country. And I hate them for that.
That's Milo. He's on with me today. He's going to be here with me the whole hour. So if you can get through 866-95-PATRIOT, we'll try to take some of you on this. And Milo, there's a couple of big points here in terms of the broader patterns that are going on that you highlight. And one of them is tribalism, is that I try to be a reasonable and rational person, and I'm just seeing a math problem here where virtually every group of people is being told that the whites are the problems. It's straight white males who are creating all the problems in society, and straight white males are seeing their numbers or their percentage of relative to the rest of the population diminish. And so you would think that this would push them to sometimes take up really dumb, fringy ideas in increasing numbers. And I start thinking about, well, why is the media fomenting this? Why does the media want to continue to focus on this when they must see how destructive it is for society to go away from the Martin Luther King values of don't judge someone by their skin tone, judge them by the content of their character. Well, it's really the left that has pushed this rejuvenation of racial discussions. We didn't talk about race nearly as much until Barack Obama became president. It is a obsession now, people's skin color. And I just want to know if you see any patterns in all that.
I certainly do. But you know what's interesting about it is one of the ways in which the left always subverts its own stated objectives feminism has been a disaster for women, absolutely terrible for them, with increased participation in the workforce and all of the different things that have happened to women socially since the Second World War. They've reported themselves as progressively more unhappy every single decade. So sure, they might have better healthcare at work, but they're really, really miserable. And feminism has been a disaster for women's happiness. Well, if you look carefully, you see that progressives do this all over the place. They invented this concept of white privilege, which is supposed to suggest that if you were born white in America, you inherit the privileges associated with your skin color. And other people similarly inherit drawbacks associated with their skin color, whether it's assumptions in social situations or access to certain resources. Well, it's never really quite true that this is the way the world operated. And it certainly wasn't true for the millions of white working class voters who asked for a Trump presidency because their standard of living hasn't improved in 15 years. It doesn't seem fair when you start to factor in affirmative action. And as men being the problem, well, if you look at all of the programs for women in college, you see women shooting ahead in terms of enrollment and grades and graduation, all the rest of it. This white privilege thing, like the patriarchy, it was all intended to kind of to attack straight white males, the straight white male of social justice folklore. Well, when you start to unpack the various components of this, it doesn't seem to make very much sense unless the left wins. Because if the left wins and manages to persuade us all to think of ourselves as a club, like gays or blacks or women, if the left succeeds, and this white privilege actually might become real, because what will happen is the public will start to lose its tolerance for unfair things like affirmative action. The idea that there should be some sort of quota system for college places and all the rest of it. If the left insists, if the left forces everybody into thinking of themselves as a member of a particular tribe, people will start acting in their tribe's best interests. And they will say, no, there will be no more quotas for women in science. There will be no more quotas for black people in higher education. There will be no more, quotas for particular groups on company boards. I'll let people just work on merit. And the left won't like the results of that very much. They won't like the world that builds. And so if there's a pattern to be discerned, it's the constant self-sabotage and subversion that the progressive left constantly commits against itself, which tells you that this is not really about it's not really about a stated goal of equality or progressiveness or getting a more diverse, inclusive society. What it's really about is simply confusing, destroying, tearing down the institutions that have made the left strong and made the West strong and made the West great in order to replace it with communism, replace it with socialism. This is not about, some glorious, glittering, multi-tonal, polyamorous, polygender utopia that they want, this glittering world that they say they want to build. It's not about that. What it's about is hurting you. It's about tearing down the church, tearing down education, tearing down the government, and replacing it with something gruesome and different. And that's always been their stated goal since Saul Alinsky. You can read it. They don't make a secret.
No, and I mentioned this. I'm glad you mentioned that. I mentioned it earlier in the show, Milo. It's in their playbook. Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, these guys talked about this stuff. It's open. All right, so let's take a break. Yeah. When we come back, I've identified something here why the media is obsessively covering these white nationalist protesters, but they will not cover Milo and his best-selling book Dangerous, which you should all pick up now. I think I figured out why that is, why they're covering one and not the other. Milo with me all hour as well. So pick up his new book Dangerous, 4 or 5 weeks in a row on the New York Times bestseller list. An audiobook still to come. We're going to get into his free speech week, and we're going to get into my theory on why the media won't cover his best-selling book, but will cover white racists at a stupid rally. But I do want to talk to some of you throughout the country, and we'll bring in Milo for this as well. Let's talk to Ian in Pennsylvania, line 1. What's going on, Ian? You're on Breitbart News.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
I was listening to the caller before talking about how he agreed with taking down the statues because when he drove into some of these small towns, he would say, I wouldn't want to stop for gas. To me, I was in the military. I had called you once before about repealing Obamacare. That's praiseworthiness to me. when I was stationed down south, I was also in Germany. The first time I saw German soldiers, their uniforms haven't changed much from World War II. I mean, I got off the plane. It was this cringeworthiness that, again, the old saying, let's never forget. Well, you know what? That's perpetuating. We don't forget. We don't make the same mistakes of the past and repeat things, which as human beings, we seem to do over and over again.
Yeah, but Ian, can you relate to the fact that so many blacks are told their entire lives that the South is racist, and that if anyone shows any reverence or even interest in Civil War figures from the South or people from the Confederacy or from America pre-Civil War, that they must have some sort of latent racism inside of them?
No, it's to me, it's the same as Nazi Germany. If people are talking about Hitler and the Nazis, or I see World War II movies, I don't see the producers or the people talking about this as being anti-Semitic. I mean, you're talking about a point in history, and it needs to be talked about, and it needs to be go over and over again, because you know what, this was a bad time in American history, and who wants that to repeat itself? I mean, if you let the left rewrite history, which happens, it's been happening the course of human evolution, that it's just going to keep repeating itself over and over again. I have this discussion with my kids about the Holocaust. I mean, they only knew about the Holocaust. I'm like, well, there was a whole Spanish Inquisition that they're just not really taught about. I'm like, well, maybe if everything was perpetuated, the education of the past, we might not have had a Holocaust the second time or the third time.
Thanks, Ian. I appreciate the call, and I want to get Milo's thoughts on this. Now, Milo, one of the topics of discussion today has actually been the origin of the rallies, that they were at least supposed to be about the Robert E. Lee statue, that the plan is to take it down. And my thoughts were, if you start whitewashing parts of history you don't like that are still parts of history, then what happens when people that you don't agree with politically take control of the government? Then they can start doing the exact same right back at you, and that's a slippery slope I have no interest in going down, and I wanted your thoughts.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. Of course you're right about that. Of course, if we forget history, we're doomed to repeat it. But there's something else that I find amusing about this, which is the left, that likes to present itself as the side of reason, science, and logic, the party of science. Yes. Well, they seem to have a very selective appreciation for and reverence for science when it suits them. I mean, for instance, in college campuses, denying the biological bases for a lot of the differences between men and women. And we saw that, with the Google memo. You've got left-wing Wikipedia editors, I read this on Breitbart, in fact, left-wing Wikipedia editors attempting to change the contents of an encyclopedia to win a political battle about diversity at Google. Attempting to censor and to downplay studies that show differences between men and women. They just don't want to believe that biology is real, some of these people. Well, something that is of the same is going on here. And it's the left refusing to understand how people function. And it feeds into the triggering and safe spaces culture. What we know from evolutionary biology, what we know from cognitive behavioral therapy is that if, for instance, you have a terrible experience and you were raped, the best thing to help you get over it is not that you never hear the word rape again in the rest of your life, and that you never hear the name of the person who did it, and that nothing associated with that situation ever occurs to you again. Because in fact, what that does is it creates a sort of specter where if any of those things were to suddenly appear after 20 years, you would fall into a heap and be a sobbing, uncontrollable mess. Actually, controlled exposure to small things related to your trauma is by far the best way to help you get over it. And this is why the triggering and safe spaces culture in universities is so stupid and so runs completely counter to how people actually function. If you really are traumatized by a historical event, whether it is mythological, whether it happened to your great-great-great-great-granddad, or whether it happened to you last summer, the best way to get over it is, in fact, to be confronted with it in things like literature. But in this case, thinking about history and the way people's minds work, hiding bad stuff doesn't work. Hiding bad stuff has the opposite effect to the one that the left says it wants. Because for the people who do have a sneaking admiration or suspicion or at least curiosity about ugly things, hiding them makes them attractive. Taking something out of the public square, saying that it is forbidden, saying that it is so dangerous and so awful that you're not even allowed to see it or talk about it or name it, like they do with the Holocaust in Germany, but you're not allowed to deny it. So stupid speech laws like that. It makes it very attractive for people who are susceptible to that kind of ugly ideology. It's the same psychology as, let's say, in Madonna's music videos in the 1990s. She was being banned from MTV. It's the same psychology, in fact, I think. Behind people, one of the reasons, in addition to it being a great book, that people are liking my book and buying it is that they've seen so many people, the entire media and publishing industry is desperate to crush it. And it makes them wonder why. So it works for good ideologies as well as bad ideologies. It works for every ideology, actually. You ban it, people get curious. People wonder what it's all about, and they start looking into it more.
It's counterculture. Yes, it's punk rock.
Of course, it's so attractive.
So what's ironic is that the left is sort of making some of these horrible groups punk rock, and I think they're doing so intentionally. Now, let me walk you through this, and I teased this before the break, Milo, and I've noticed a pattern because I'm looking at the Huffington Post front page, and the headline is "Next time will be worse," with a bunch of angry white people standing there with
is that a threat or a promise?
I don't know. They're standing there with their Bed Bath and Beyond tiki torches because this is truly the face. Right. This is truly the face of pure evil on the planet right now. This is the main problem: is these goofballs with their tiki torches. And not to say that there aren't a couple of evil people in the mix. Of course there are, and they have some horrible ideas. But the Huffington Post is pumping them up, and then the reason is, I think, in my opinion, because overall it helps them. It lets them make a claim about you, about me, about Dr. Gorka, about Steve Bannon, about Donald Trump, about the Republican Party, about conservative values, about the United States of America, and that's what they're doing here. So on the flip side, we've got your book, Dangerous. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list 4 weeks or so. It was as high as number 2. It was the Amazon bestseller list, I think 3 separate occasions. It's sold tons of copies, and yet it's not getting covered in the mainstream press. And the reason is because whenever you debate people in the mainstream press, Milo, it goes bad for the mainstream press. It does not help them. They look stupid. And so that is the math I'm trying to put together here, is that the white supremacists get tons of airtime because they look stupid. Milo gets no airtime because it makes the press look stupid. What am I missing?
I think you're right. And I think that if conservatives were smarter, they'd do more. Actually, prior to Trump, I think conservatives just didn't do this back. They didn't return this in kind. But I think in the age of Trump, with Trump supporters and the ridicule and the attention given to Antifa, I think conservatives are getting better at this. It's, of course, in any political operative's best interests to suggest that the most extreme elements of his opposition are reflective of the whole. So you'll see in the groups that the left likes, it will say, for instance, Muslims, it will say that any terrorist attack is the act of a lone wolf. We may never know the motive. It must be something to do with gun control. Certainly can't have anything to do with their ideology, because that would suggest there's something sick, twisted, and ugly about the ideology that makes it antithetical to Western way of life and suggests Muslims will never be able to integrate. We can't have that. So we'll say it's a lone wolf. But if it's an ideological opponent, if it's somebody that we want to damage, if it's somebody we want to alienate ordinary, normal, mainstream people from, we will say, aha, you see, this is a glimpse into the dark underbelly of the enemy. This little thing that has popped up in Charlottesville. Well, if only you knew how deep the rock went. If only you knew that this actually is the real reason Donald Trump's in the White House. And that's why you should hate him. And that's why you should hate all Republicans. And that's why you should hate everyone right-wing of Jane Fonda. And that's why you should only like us, because only we are going to give you a pure, decent, politically correct, safe code for living that will enable you to move through polite society guilt-free. Only we are your path to salvation. That's at the root of all of this. So, of course, it's in their interests to celebrate the most extreme voices on the other side and to bury the voices which are the most reasonable and persuasive. And that's exactly what's happening. Your analysis is exactly right.
Yeah, and look at the flip side. Look at the flip side, Milo. So you've got one Nazi guy or neo-Nazi, whoever this monster was that ran these people with the car, that will become the face of right of center thought in the United States, according to the media. But then you've got on the flip side these Antifa protesters that are really left-wing agitators. We've got my old pal Yvette Falarka from By Any Means Necessary.
I love her.
And people who listen to the show know that she was really one of the top one or two leftist organizers in Berkeley while I was there 12 years ago. And so now she's a new foil for you. These are people who literally have in the title of their group that they will use any means necessary to push their leftist political agenda. And so this is them justifying violence in certain instances, which she has done. Yet you have someone on the right who justifies violence, which is incredibly unpopular on the right, yet that is held up as the paragon of right-wing thought, whereas on the flip side, the violent people on the left totally ignored by the press.
Well, I think it's that hypocrisy. I think it's that double think. It's that blatant, brazen lack of integrity and decency from the media, from the institutional left, that makes people do things like vote Trump. I mean, consider, somebody reminded me of this last night, consider what happened last year when 5 cops were murdered by racist, violent Black Lives Matter protesters in Dallas. You remember what Obama said? He said, we've all seen this bigotry in our lives at some point. And I'm quoting exactly, quote, none of us is entirely innocent. No institution is entirely immune. And that includes our police departments. We know this, end quote. So Obama's blaming the 5 murdered cops for their own deaths, saying that we can't turn away and dismiss those in peaceful protest as troublemakers or paranoid, and saying that the police are responsible for their own deaths. Can you imagine if anybody on the right had suggested that the victims of violent, hateful, racist ideologies were in some way responsible for their own deaths, like they had it coming, they'd done something to deserve it. Like if Trump had said, well, those Antifa protesters came out spoiling for a fight and they got what they were looking for, which frankly is true. If Trump had said anything like that, can you imagine the response? Can you imagine the reaction? He would be hounded from office even by Republicans because they've become so utterly subservient to political correctness and to the media. And it's that kind of shameless double thinking, the horrible double standards. It's that kind of now, I think, ingrained unfairness, this structural unfairness, if you like, toward anyone conservative, right of center, Republican, libertarian, whatever, that I think makes people like Trump, makes people vote for Trump, makes people read Breitbart, makes people read my book, drives them away from the left, in a way that is more effective, really, than anything conservatives have done for the last 30 years. It's the hypocrisy. It's the smug, overfed, grinning hypocrisy of an of a movement that knows it's in total control and it can do anything and say anything without consequence because all of its friends will back it up every single time. So if a left-wing comedian says something horrible, it won't just be excused, then people will come out to defend them. And I think they should be able to say all kinds of horrible things. Comedians should be able to say whatever they want. But the point is that, on the right, conservatives have been bullied and browbeaten by the left into ejecting troublesome people on their own side for misspeaking, while those on the left who say appalling and disgusting things are celebrated and venerated and are defended by their friends. CNN can brazenly lie to its viewers, and I think by now it's not conspiratorial or exaggerated to say that CNN deliberately lies to people. I believe that they do. CNN can deliberately lie about people and expect not just a pass from the media, but the New York Times coming to its defense. And that's unthinkable on the right. Look at the quarrels and bitching and backstabbing and infighting on the right. When anybody is seen to have stepped away from noble principle, it's completely different. And it's based on tribalism and a sort of opportunistic, a victory at any cost, or you might even say by all means necessary, that is in the DNA of the left, but it isn't in the DNA of the right. And that's why the right has been losing the culture war for 30 years.
And Milo, I want to get into some personal stuff with you. We got a lot to get to in the last 8 or 10 minutes we have left. But the breaking news this morning, GoDaddy You guys might remember them. They're the web hosting service where you can buy domains that got a lot of attention for putting, shall we say, scantily clad women in their advertisements. Well, they've seized the moral high ground by banning the Daily Stormer, which is a white nationalist website. And what's amazing to me, Milo, about this is, first of all, the GoDaddy virtue signaling is hilarious on its face. Second of all, the Daily Stormer, by the way, has boycotted Breitbart because we let you write for us and other gay people. Also interesting.
You'll never hear that in the media, that the Daily Stormer, where the white supremacist hub on the internet hates me and hates Breitbart. That's not coming to CNN anytime soon.
Yes, exactly. And most importantly of all, with this endlessly amusing story, is get this, ladies and gentlemen. Last I checked, the Daily Stormer was white supremacist yesterday too, and the day before, and a year ago, and 2 years ago. Yet GoDaddy decides to ban them today. This virtue signaling is just getting absolutely ridiculous at this point.
I think, to be clear, the Daily Stormer hates me, hates you, and we hate them. But there's a problem here, which is that a corporation that does this, that is going to commit let's call it viewpoint discrimination, is likely to do it again. And next time, it might not be white supremacists. Next time, it might be just regular right-wingers. Next time, it might be perfectly respectable, reasonable people like you and me. And it's exactly what the left did in the last election. They extended the definition of white supremacist, white nationalist to include basically the other half of the country. And when they do so, it legitimizes virtue signaling on a grand scale from corporations that start to take away the rights of conservatives. Now, this sort of question of the GoDaddy thing tests our conservative principles to their absolute limit, because it is a private corporation and they should be able to do whatever they want. The First Amendment doesn't apply to them. And Americans rightly are very skeptical and mistrustful of anyone who seeks to influence how corporations do business. But two things to say on that are, firstly, Orwell was wrong, or at least his book was incomplete. And he didn't foresee the role that corporate America would play in censorship in the future. He thought it would just be the government. Actually, as it turns out, there's a reason Americans hate the federal government. Your government sucks. It's useless. It's completely incompetent. So if it were only the government trying to enforce viewpoint censorship, it wouldn't be such a problem. But corporate America is on the train too, and it's corporate America that I think that ordinary Americans need to worry the most about, because it has so much more of an impact on their daily lives. And
absolutely, and they are, Milo. They are buying the full social justice warrior line here, which is why I know that we always knew Daily Storm was racist. Why was this acceptable to GoDaddy until this morning?
Right, and the issue is, that corporate America is really great at what it does. America has the best capitalists in the world, so its companies tend to be really successful. So they often become monopolies, and when they become monopolies, like let's say Twitter, for instance, which has a monopoly on certain kinds of speech, or at least important sorts of speech in journalism and in politics, in publishing and various other entertainment media, in a particular kind of square. Twitter sort of has a total monopoly on certain kinds of speech in public life. Well, then becomes the question, this is for the left-wingers to consider, if there was any other kind of organization that had that sort of stranglehold on a particular industry or a particular part of daily life, wouldn't they be calling for it to be regulated like a public utility? Wouldn't they be requiring Twitter to at least consider the First Amendment dimensions of the decisions it makes and not ban prominent conservatives? Mentioning no names, of course. Wouldn't it? And this is why it tests conservative principles, because this sort of thing makes us very uncomfortable wading into the affairs of private companies until those private companies become monopolies. And when their monopoly is in tech or in oil or in any other industry, we're perfectly happy to poke our heads around the door and say, hang on, can we just make sure that what you're doing is responsible and serving everyone well? Or otherwise we might have to make some rules for you guys, Tech as yet has escaped this kind of attention, except Google in Europe, where there's antitrust stuff brought around by the EU to try to keep its power in check. Europeans are a little more horrified than Americans by things like Street View, which Germans had. I think it's still banned in Germany, but it was for a long time anyway. The idea that Google could send these driverless cars around and take pictures of your house Most Europeans don't like that very much. They find it too intrusive. They don't like the idea of it at all. Americans are a little bit cooler about it, but so only really the EU has gone after Google for some antitrust, some anti-competitive practices. But in America, at home, where these companies grew up, they remain the only industry that is completely untouched by any kind of monopolies law. And that, I think, is probably going to change.
No, it has to change because it's become a monopoly. And one thing that is really interesting, and Milo, we only have a minute left in the show. Pick up the book Dangerous, a bestseller. Is that if you look at the pattern with Google and their political correctness, them pushing multiculturalism, YouTube, there's an exodus of conservatives from YouTube because they feel like they're facing discrimination. And it's almost a rush to virtual signal against conservatives. This is exactly why you're going to be doing a free speech week that's coming up. Can you give us a hint as to what we can expect with that coming up?
I can. Have you ever been delighted by the sight of me on YouTube triggering liberals, or if you've ever been delighted by the sight of screaming, wailing, distressed Hillary fans ripping their own hair out after election night? If you've ever enjoyed the sight of free speech read in tooth and claw in all of its provocative and intellectually challenging glory, then we're going to be hosting Berkeley Free Speech Week, which won't just be for conservatives, it'll be for everybody. It's sort of my response, really, my reaction against the violent tendencies on the far right and the far left. And it is a celebration of peaceful, provocative ideas. I want people to be violent with words. I want people to be appalling to each other with language and with ideas. And I want a ferocious, vigorous battle of ideologies instead of a physical one. To see, it is my sort of week-long live celebration of classical liberalism, of J.S. Mill, of the open marketplace of ideas. So it'll be Berkeley Free Speech Week in September, and that will kick off my new Troll Academy tour, which I'm sure I will tell you more about next time I'm on.
Yes, and you'll be on very soon, and good to see you back out there. Mr. Milo, pick up the book Dangerous yet again. Thank you, sir.